the meeting's being recorded. Yes, let me go ahead and share my screen. Okay. All right. Let me. So, okay. So this is our agenda for today. So why this training? Current framework, why disparities? Gender 101 is going to be kind of the majority of it. What issues we have to overcome in the field, and then trans welcoming practices. I think I'm at the wrong point in the training. Give me just 1 second. Sorry, as we work out some. Okay, I see. This is around. Yeah, there we go. Okay. And Leah, if you don't mind helping me to monitor the chat, because sometimes it's a little bit hard to pull it open while I'm doing the presentation. No, thank you so much. Okay, so yeah, this is healing beyond the binary, beyond male and female. So just gonna start with some basic information about me. So I have a dual master's in social work and public health that I got from UNC Chapel Hill in 2016. In my master's program, I focused on LGBTQ experiences of intimate violence, both SA and DV. I worked at a rape crisis center after graduation. I now do training and consulting on LGBTQ issues, as well as trauma issues, and I am part of the community myself. So we kind of already answered. I appreciate folks jumping in the chat. We'll see what the other responses are about this. And then I'm also hoping to drop, if you could all just drop in the chat, what you hope to get out of this workshop so that I can kind of make sure to cover the content that folks are wanting to see. And as you do that, Leah, if you don't mind just shouting, or if folks want to unmute and shout out as well, that's fine. Yeah, if folks don't mind shouting out. Leah, if you can shout out what's in the chat as folks drop it in. So yeah, please just say in the chat, what is your goal? What do you hope to get out of this workshop? Is there any particular kind of questions that you have to start out with? Okay, Alexandra is here, cool, okay.
Yeah, hey Annalie. So we have from Jenna that she has been to one other training, and Sharon has said hello.
Hi everyone. I'm hoping to learn more about POC trans identities. Yeah, we do have some of that, awesome. And I will kind of, keeping that in mind, there's a couple other things I think aren't in, but that I can add. Here to learn everything, anything and everything. Cool, thank you, Jenny. Let's see if we can get one more before I jump in. Expand my knowledge and vocabulary, ensure I'm using correct definitions, enrich knowledge, and keep up to date. Okay, folks are looking for kind of general info. Perfect, this is a great starting place for that. Okay, so some agreements, speak for yourself. Go ahead and meet your needs, grab food, take your dog for a walk, whatever you got to do. Have your camera on if you can. It is so nice to see. You all know how alienating it is to be on a Zoom call and not see faces. It can be really helpful to see faces. I want to shout out Sharon. Thank you so much. I love seeing your face. So yeah, anyone who is not multitasking, is able to turn that camera on. I really appreciate y'all for doing that. Yeah, be respectful of others' experiences as well. I think I might have missed stuff in the chat. Okay, want to provide the proper advocacy. Awesome. Hope to gain better understanding. Great, great. Okay. So why this training? So I know that some folks were invited who, are not working in rape crisis centers. I would say about 10% of the training is kind of specific to sexual violence, which of course is relevant outside of that particular setting as well. But a lot of it is pretty universal. But what led to this series of workshops with NC CASA is that their rates of sexual violence are higher for the LGBTQ plus community than among cis straight people. And so kind of focusing in on trans people who are the focus of this workshop, the lifetime prevalence of sexual violence victimization among trans people is about 66%. It kind of varies from survey to survey, but that's about where it is. At the same time, service providers have a willingness to serve LGBTQ people, maybe even an enthusiasm to do so, but they remain underserved. So there's kind of this gap between our intentions, our goals, and the impact, the outcome, right? And so my kind of thinking is, what if these gaps are due to more than specific practices, but to the ways we kind of conceptualize sexual violence itself? And so this is kind of some of the impetus for the framing of the workshop. So growing consensus is that our traditional but changing ways of thinking as providers is too limiting, not just for queer and trans communities, but for all the communities we serve. So I feel like this offers this opportunity that our earnest desire to serve LGBTQ people gives us a chance to serve all clients better. And so we'll begin to work on shifting and expanding our understanding of sexual violence, gender, sex, to move beyond binaries. Okay, so I think folks who've been here before kind of know the answers to some of this. We're going to move quicker through this than usual. I cut out some of this introductory content so we have time for the 101. But what are binaries? Does someone want to go ahead and give some examples or a definition? You can unmute or just drop it in the chat. Any thoughts? Okay, something in the chat. Let's see if I can pull it up. Sometimes it just doesn't work. Nope, not happening. Does anyone want to read what's in the chat for me?
Yeah, so please correct me if I pronounce this wrong. Nene said male female is a binary.
Perfect. So that's the primary one we're going to talk about today. Good work. What are some other examples?
I know I can offer like good and bad is another binary.
Absolutely. Yeah. So binaries are these like seeming opposites, right? And they're mutually exclusive. You can only be one or the other. And so I think we can tend to see the world in terms of binaries. You know, another one is like nature versus nurture. This comes up a lot when we're talking about sex and gender and sexuality. So what is a yeah, I think, you know, what is a pro of kind of seeing the world this way in general, not just about gender, but about lots of things, like perpetrator and survivor is another one that comes up a lot in our work. What are the benefits of kind of perceiving things this way? Yeah, feel free to drop it in the chat or unmute. I see someone typing.
So Jenny said less ambiguity.
Less ambiguity. Yeah, I think it kind of reduces our mental load, like especially when we're in this field, you know, when we're able to see people's lives in more simplistic terms, it makes our work easier. And it even, you know, might reduce like some, I don't know, I think it's a little bit complicated, but some of the symptoms of like stress or burnout, right? When we're just able to be like, you know what, this is neat, this is tidy, I can see what's happening here. And so then what are the cons or kind of the flip side of that?
Stephanie also shared it's simplistic.
Right, it's too simplistic. It doesn't actually reflect the realities of people's lives, right? So we know that, like, for example, some perpetrators are survivors, some survivors are perpetrators, some people are not male or female, people are not good or bad, right? Like, things are messy in reality. And so when we acknowledge that, when we fully see that, we're able to serve clients better. And so this is why by moving beyond binaries broadly, we're able to do better work, not just with trans clients or non-binary clients, but with all clients. And so that is kind of the framing I would like you all to hold moving forward and to kind of carry forth out of this workshop is like, are there places that I'm thinking in binary terms that I don't need to? And what would it be like to kind of move past that? And so this was something I was thinking for a while, and then I read, I guess I didn't include it in this one, but so I read this paper that's that was a review of all the qualitative articles about healing from sexual violence and people's process of healing, and it reviewed like a lot, like the number of papers it reviewed was like in the teens, and it said that synthesizing contradictions was the essence of healing. Like that was its big takeaway, that healing from trauma is about kind of bringing together these dualities, because part of the experience of trauma and the symptoms of trauma is kind of thinking in binary terms, right? And so when we're able to transcend binaries, we're not just doing better work, we're actually helping folks to heal more fully. Okay, so this is my very abstract philosophical piece of my training. So I touched on these disparities. Trans people are experiencing sexual violence at very high rates. Why is that the case is something that comes up a lot. Folks often have that curiosity. And, you know, I think that this explanation also applies to other disparities that you hear about with trans folks as well, particularly with violence. Yeah, so why are rates higher? So LGBTQ people face disproportionate violence at 3 levels. So they face systemic and institutional violence. So they're like exclusion from settings like the workforce, or, you know, bullying in schools, put LGBTQ folks in situations such as homelessness, foster care, or survival sex work that make them more vulnerable to sexual violence. So in this category, we're also including kind of family violence, right? And so we're considering the family an institution here. Then kind of once they're in those vulnerable situations, are facing predatory violence from outside the community. So an example of this is that of trans women who interacted with the police while police thought they were doing sex work, and those are majority trans women of color, right? 27% were sexually assaulted by the police. So that's like a very high rate of abuse by police officers. So just, yeah, I think some pieces of this presentation are triggering, and I apologize I didn't say that sooner. And so this is one of them. And so when I say take care of yourself, like, yeah, whatever you kind of need to do around that. I did try to take out some of the just like horrifying statistic stuff, but there is still some, because I think it's important to, yeah, to recognize, but I recognize that it might be kind of hard to hear. So this is a quote I found helpful. Across the lifespan, sexual violence is a penalty for stepping out of normative gender roles. And so then folks are also facing domestic violence from inside the community. And so rates of IPV among LGBTQ folks are at least as high as the rest of the population, although I just want to point out abusers may not be LGBTQ. So, you know, when we're talking about bisexual people who have a very high rate of IPV, or trans people, their partners may not identify as part of the community, may not be part of the community, may be cis and straight. But evidence, you know, some of them may be, and evidence shows that IPV is linked to life stressors, including minority stress, right? And so when you're facing these other stressors, like we've kind of talked about, these kind of institutional settings, you know, those can, that feeling of being out of control can lead to folks exerting power and control tactics in their relationships. Okay. You know, and I think what is left out of this summary is a lot of the stuff y'all may be familiar with around kind of rates of mental illness or suicide, you know, which are fueled by some of these same factors. Okay, so now we're going to do this Gender 101 piece, which is kind of the primary piece of this training. Okay, so this is the framework that I like to use to teach gender and sexuality. It's a graphic that was made by the Trans Student Educational Resources. So I think in the bisexual workshop, we talked about the sexual attraction piece, which is the 2 bottom ones, or physically and emotionally attraction piece. But I think there's a few, zooming in on the gender stuff, there's a few takeaways. So gender identity, sex assigned at birth, and gender expression are not binary, and they don't always align, right? So let's zoom in on that a little bit further. So we used to think of all 3 of these things, men and women, male and female, and masculine and feminine, as binaries. And we used to think of them as being consistent, right? So like men are male and they're masculine, women are female and they're feminine. So then I think, you know, it was this very revolutionary thing to think of some of these categories more as a spectrum, a little bit more fluid, right? And so what is different here about these sliders? Like, I think if it was a spectrum, you would have an arrow from let's say female, woman, girl to man, male, boy on the other end, right? Like a spectrum from one to the other. So why do we have the sliders instead? What are the sliders, these kind of one-way arrows, offer us that kind of a spectrum model wouldn't? Any thoughts on that? It's okay if you don't get this one. It's kind of a complex question, but if you do have the answer, drop it in the chat. Degrees of, okay, yeah, so that's one piece. I think we could get that from a little bit from a spectrum as well. Any other thoughts before I just jump ahead and tell you? Transition or growth? Yeah, I think that absolutely does show here. It takes out the binary. Excellent. The spectrum doesn't include other. Beautiful, beautiful. Thank you, Samantha and Katrina. Yeah, so one piece is that if you have this spectrum, so like, let me go back. If you have a spectrum, the more you're moving towards feminine or female, you're moving away from masculine or male, right? But what this offers us is that you can be very feminine, very masculine at the same time. And it gives us this other category of other genders that's kind of outside of this sort of plane that moves from masculine or feminine or male or female, right? Okay, so now I'm going to kind of jump from the ones that do have these sliders. Does that make sense? Any questions on that? So, and I also like to say when I'm doing this that what we are trying to capture and describe, and what trans folks are trying to capture in like a graphic like this, a framework like this, is people's lived experiences, right? It is not just a theoretical framework. And so, you know, I think sometimes politically people push back and say trans isn't real. And I'm like, that's kind of like saying anger isn't real. This is a subjective internal experience, right? And so we don't get to say that, you know, we don't know that for someone else. Okay, so we're moving to quickly the more biological piece, and then we'll come back to this other kind of internal piece. So we have sex assigned at birth, we have female and male and intersex. So I think sometimes I've heard the term biological sex used to describe this piece. However, biological sex is actually like a really messy, murky concept, especially when we're talking about trans people. Are we talking about primary sex characteristics, secondary sex characteristics? Are we talking about chromosomes? Are we talking about genitals? What if people's genitals change throughout their life because they decide to have surgery? What if they take hormones and their secondary sex characteristics change? What if, like, at puberty, things don't happen the way that they're expected to happen? And so biological sex isn't, what do we mean by that? It's actually pretty messy. And so sex assigned at birth is a kind of it's like what sex assigned at birth is like what the doctor said when you were born. So like a baby emerges from the womb and the doctor is like, it's a girl, it's a boy. So that's sex assigned at birth. We're able to determine that at the specific kind of moment in time, like what goes on the birth certificate. So that's kind of it's a kind of a neat way to describe this particular construct. I saw that someone said something in the chat, but I can't pull up the chat right now. Alexandra, would you mind?
I can read out to you, Noah, if you want.
So yeah, that'd be great.
Sharon said, I appreciate you speaking on the lived experience piece.
Awesome. Thank you, Sharon. So I included a birth certificate here that says intersex. So intersex is like, which we'll define in a second. What is intersex? It's when someone does not fit into the kind of the binary of male or female. Intersex is the third category. Typically, though, doctors will make they'll fit it into the binary, fit this child and their anatomy into this binary, even if it doesn't neatly fit. And so there are a few states where there is the option of putting intersex on a birth certificate. I want to say it's like Washington, maybe New York, like progressive states. North Carolina is not one of them. And so that is what that looks like on a birth certificate, but it doesn't happen very often. So here's a little video about what it's like to be intersex. I want to make sure that I'm sharing my, oh, here we go. Share sound. Okay.
Raise your hands
Can you all
if
hear?
you have testes. I'm Pigeon.
I'm Alice.
I'm Emily.
I'm Cypher.
And we are Intersexy.
Intersex describes a person who doesn't fit the typical definition of male or female.
I have XY chromosomes, but typical female genitalia.
I'm a girl who has testes and XY chromosomes.
I identify as a queer, gender nonconforming intersex person.
I identify as a Black intersex man.
Intersex is not new. It's been around since the beginning of human existence. I mean, there's probably even intersex dinosaurs, if you think about it.
Transgender has to deal with your gender identity, whereas intersex has to deal with your biological characteristics.
Often, intersex people get surgeries that they don't want, and transgender people have to fight for surgeries that they do want. They gave my mom the excuse that the internal testes were cancerous, that I would develop cancer.
They didn't even come up with an excuse, basically, in terms of a health-related reason. They instead just said it was about the appearance.
A lot of doctors are very uncomfortable with the idea that I have testes, and they're still trying to get them removed, but I'm perfectly healthy and there's nothing wrong with them.
They did a surgery to remove my testes and told my parents to take me home and just raise me as a girl, and I didn't find out about it myself until I was 12.
There aren't a lot of options, or medical providers don't explore other options. My mom would put me in dresses and she would be like, "Oh, aren't you so cute and you're so pretty?" And I would be like, "No, this is horrible." I was put on hormonal treatment, which consisted of estrogen and progesterone. I just wanted to belong. I wanted to fit in. I didn't want to be different. So even though I knew something felt amiss, I conformed. He was very condescending. He was like, "You intersex activists don't know what you're talking about."
It's difficult for intersex people to find each other because from an early age we're told not to talk about our bodies.
I did feel like I was the only one.
My doctors always told me there was nobody else like me, and so it just perpetuates a vicious cycle of shame and stigma that we can't break out of. I would tell another intersex person that you are worthy, you are lovable.
Your body is beautiful. You're beautiful.
Intersex people don't need to be fixed. There's nothing wrong with them.
I know you feel like you might not be able to get through this. I know you might have really dark thoughts, but I want you to know that meeting other intersex people and finding a community or a support group can be one of the most important aspects in your healing process. And we're out there, we're out here, we're here. And I just hope you can find us.
Okay, so yeah, I think that was a really good kind of overview of some of the stigma and struggles and kind of resilience of the intersex community, which is not, something I can speak to through my lived experience. I want to just kind of clarify that they're like trans and intersex are like overlapping Venn diagrams. So like Cypher would be like, might be defined as a trans person because they were assigned female at birth and then, or he was assigned female at birth and then transitioned, right? So had kind of a trans experience of gender, even though he was also intersex. So how many people are intersex? How common is this? To answer this question in an uncontroversial way, you'd have to first get everyone to agree on what counts as intersex and also to agree on what should count as strictly male or female. Right. So it's kind of like the more we zoom in on these concepts, the more messy and troubled they are. Kind of like, have you ever seen like the magnification of like the head of a pin and like suddenly it's not pointy anymore? That's hard to do. How small does a penis have to be before it counts as intersex? Do you count sex chromosome anomalies as intersex if there's no apparent external sexual ambiguity? And this is from the Intersex Society of North America, which is a great kind of folks to Google if you want to learn more about the intersex experience and what folks are advocating for their like a great org. So this is kind of some research that's been done. So people with atypical genitalia is 1 in 1,500 to 1 in 2,000 births. People receiving surgery to normalize genital appearance is 1 or 2 in 1,000 births. But people whose bodies differ in some way from standard male or female is 1 in 100, which is about the same as the number of redheads. And so we have this quote in the video: often intersex people get surgeries that they don't want, and transgender people have to fight for surgeries that they do want. And I thought that this kind of really summed up kind of this strange paradox around like gender and sex. And I also thought that it made a really clear tie-in between the rights of trans and intersex people and the movement to end sexual violence. So what is kind of the connection implied by this quote? Any thoughts? Anyone want to drop any thoughts about that in the chat? Or share just out loud, unmute yourselves. Okay. There's a lack of consent. Excellent, Tara. Yes, exactly. Bodily autonomy, right? People have the right to control what happens to their bodies, and that includes kind of in sexual situations, that includes medically. And folks who kind of differ in some way from the norm in terms of gender and sex, just like survivors, are often kind of denied that opportunity, that right. Okay, so here's some takeaways from this section. Biological sex is a murky concept. It's not, what do we mean by that? We don't know, it's not really real. Sex assigned at birth is not a binary. Intersex people are part of the natural variation of human bodies, and intersex people have a right to bodily autonomy. Any questions about sex assigned at birth? Okay. So now we're going to talk about gender identity, and gender identity is defined as an internal sense of self. Let me just check where I'm at with time. Beautiful. I'm exactly on time, y'all. We're killing it. Okay. So yeah, so I'm going to give some examples of like what this might look like. So when gender identity is not in alignment with sex assigned at birth, someone is transgender. So what might it look like for gender identity to not be in alignment? So someone was assigned male at birth, they were born, the doctor said, it's a boy. But their gender identity, they're ranked pretty high as female or girl and kind of low as male. So that's kind of what we typically think of as transgender identity. This might be like if Caitlyn Jenner were to fill this out, maybe this is what it would look like. I don't know, I can't see in her head, but like, yeah, kind of a binary experience of a trans person. Okay, also a trans person could be non-binary. And so someone was assigned male at birth, and now they're like, I don't identify as a third gender, identify as something else. That's also trans. Okay, this person identifies as like pretty male, pretty female, and kind of something else, even more something else. So this person might identify as like polygender, bigender, or genderqueer. And this person doesn't really identify as male or female, a little bit another gender, but not so much. And so this person might identify as like agender. And all these things would be under trans identity because they're not in alignment. Okay, and so cisgender identity is when gender identity is in alignment with sex assigned at birth. And so the doctor said, it's a boy. This person now is like, I am a man. I was assigned a boy at birth. Now I identify as a man. That person would be cisgender. Okay, so kind of zooming out a little bit, we have some umbrellas. We have the cisgender umbrella. We have cis women and cis men. We have the transgender umbrella, which includes trans women, trans men, and then it includes this non-binary category, which we'll talk more about in a minute. And under the non-binary category, there's a bunch of different stuff. Bigender, agender, maybe pangender, maybe polygender, genderqueer, gender fluid. There's lots of stuff happening. A quick note, the language here affirms, sometimes people are like, they get really stressed and they're like, wait, this person was before they said they were a girl, now they say that they're a boy. Are they a trans man or a trans, like people get confused. So I think a quick way to remember it is that the word is how the person currently identifies, because you don't want to use a word that's different from how someone identifies now. You don't want to be kind of referencing something that didn't fit someone or didn't affirm them, right? And so when we say a trans woman, that person is a woman. That's how they identify now. When we say a trans man, that person identifies now as a man. Does that make sense? Cool. Okay, so would drag performers be under the trans umbrella? Any thoughts about this? And if not, what umbrella might they be under? What do y'all think? Feel free to shout it out or drop it in the chat. Are you all too nervous to weigh in on this question? Okay, some stuff is in the chat. Things are happening. Let's see if I can pull it up. I cannot pull it up. Alexander, would you mind telling me? Sorry about this glitch.
Yeah, definitely. So Heather said, I guess that would depend on how they personally identify.
Great.
Stephanie said, depends on their gender identity. You can't just know by their clothing, etc.
Excellent. Y'all are totally killing it. Yeah, so yeah, I wasn't even thinking about that. I guess I was assuming if they're cisgender. So I think, you know, the way we use language has kind of changed over time. So something that's like kind of a interesting kind of fact or bit of nuance is that like some of the trans femmes who kind of started the gay rights movement, Marsha P. Johnson, Sylvia Rivera, you know, these folks who allegedly threw the first stone at Stonewall, you know, started this riot for gay rights. You know, now we would maybe say that they're trans women, but they use the term drag queens because that was the term that was around at the time. And so I think these things kind of have been sort of muddled historically. You know, I remember one of my first exposures to trans folks was watching like a daytime talk show as a small child because my parents just left me to watch TV at like 2 p.m. and seeing like drag queens, you know, and I'm like, were they drag queens or were they trans women, right? So I think these things have been muddled, but if we're saying trans identity is an internal sense of self, right? That's kind of how we need to be defining it. So some drag performers are cisgender and it's just like a fun performance, like an act. And then they wouldn't fit this definition of trans identity. There's this other term that researchers really like to use, gender nonconforming, and that's an umbrella that drag performers might fit under because in those moments when they're performing another gender, right? So they're not kind of conforming to their sex assigned at birth.
Hey, Anneli, before we move on, I did just have a question put in the comments.
Sure.
So Ashley said, hi, this is all new to me. What does it mean to identify as a gender? Like what makes someone decide they are or aren't a gender, just how they feel?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really great question. And I think it's really like everyone has like an individual journey and it's complex, right? So earlier I said it's like a very subjective process. I sometimes like say like the level of sort of nuance and how private and like almost, let's see, what would be I'm trying to find the right words, like how personal and like private and sometimes difficult and sometimes beautiful and messy like that journey is. It almost reminds me of like how a lot of folks kind of describe their experiences of like faith, like in that, I mean, another kind of way that those things are similar is that people use language in they use language differently. They use language in complex ways. So like one person's definition of Christian might be different from another person's, but like this experience, like for someone it might be like they just realize it in an instant, and for another person it might take many years, or someone might be like, I realized it in an instant, but looking back I can see that it was many years, you know. Like I have a friend who came out and then found out after they came out that when they were when he was a child, he told his parents that he was a boy, and he doesn't remember it because he was really small, you know? So I think it's a complex journey for everybody. I don't know if that answers your question at all. That's such an excellent question, and it's hard to answer because it is just such an individual process for folks. Does anyone else want to share like what their thoughts are on that? I recognize there probably are trans folks here and folks who are familiar with the community and some expertise in the room as well. Yeah. I also think like because that process is so personal, like if we're working with folks, we want to really tread lightly around asking questions about it. And we don't necessarily, in the same way, like you don't necessarily ask someone who tells you that they're, say, Jewish about how that happened to them. Like you don't, like, it's kind of taboo to ask, like, or it's taboo to ask a cis person, like about their gender journey, right? Like how did, someone who identifies with the sex they were assigned at birth, like, how did you know you were a girl? Like, that's not a thing we tend to ask. Like, it may be perceived, this is absolutely the right space for that question. And kind of asking trans folks in your daily life or asking trans clients, that isn't always an appropriate thing to do, especially if that's not the reason that they're seeing you or something that they're wanting to talk about.
I did want to uplift another question we have, and you may address it a little bit later on in this slide. So Nene asked, if someone does not conform to a gender, how can they identify as a woman? I'm referring to the term non-binary woman.
Yeah, so let's see, like, I really appreciate that question. Let's see if we can come back to it in a little bit, because I think we'll kind of flesh out what this means a little bit. Okay, so I think it's, again, we, like, in the beginning, I kind of framed the conversation as like, binaries aren't real, right? And so, yeah, people use language in complex ways as kind of one way to answer that question. So yeah, so trans women are women. So under this umbrella of women, we're going to have trans women, cis women, and non-binary women. And again, we'll talk more about non-binary in a little bit. Trans men are men. So under the category of men, trans men, cis men, non-binary men. Gay men date trans men. Straight women date trans men, right? Like men are men. So kind of an implication here, if gender is about identity, then transgender is not about moving from one identity to another. It's not about the migration, right? It's not about that process. It is about the internal sense of self. So what would it look like if we were to stop defining transness by transition and start defining it by personhood? So kind of linguistically, what this means is, like, Elliot Page did not become a man, right? Elliot Page is a man. Elliot Page has been a man. He went through a process of figuring that out, of coming out, right? And so one way to kind of respect people's genders is to use the pronoun that they use now, even when we're talking about the past. So Elliot Page, he was a small child at one point. Okay. So this kind of answers this last question. Non-binary people can be men or women or just non-binary, right? So people may kind of, going back to how is that possible? I think if we go back to that slide, let's see if I can. All right, we'll just give it a second to load. Yeah, when I kind of broke out these different gender identities, right? So there's one that is a non-binary. Yes, okay, this is a great example. This person might identify as a non-binary man because, well, maybe that's not, let's see, what about this one? No, I don't have, well, yeah, okay, so like if, let's see, yes, now this person might identify as a non-binary man, or like now they might identify as a non-binary woman, right? Because they feel both like another gender and like a woman, if that kind of helps. So like these things can kind of happen at the same time. I don't know if does that make sense? How is that? Also, like, a lot of this is new. These are ways that we don't typically think about gender, right? So I understand that like part of what's happening right now is like our brains are just like slowly expanding a little bit, and like that's okay. We're not trying to get them to totally explode. We're just like growing, you know? So yeah, there's these things are overlapping. So when we're talking about non-binary people have existed forever throughout history. And so this is, PBS did a special on this, and this is their map of all of the indigenous cultures that have had a third gender, or more than two genders. And so as you can see, there are places in North America, in the Americas, really all around the world where humans have lived, there have been non-binary people. And so I think one of the myths is that trans people, it's like a newfangled idea. Non-binary is a newfangled idea. And so I just really want to state that it's not, right? Like white supremacy, colonialism enforced a gender binary, but that's the thing that's newfangled. And so kind of related to that, someone at the beginning wanted to know about kind of POC specific identities. So Two-Spirit is one.
As a Two-Spirit person, some folks might identify me as being transgender, from going from one gender to the next, but I never left the person that I was, even though my appearance may have changed. I'm all those things and then some. So I grew up in the Great Lakes of northern Wisconsin. Every weekend we would go to different powwows, we'd go to different ceremonies. This is where I got to learn about my identity and who I was becoming and am today. So in the Anishinaabe language, we refer to Two-Spirit as Nijmanituwag. It's the idea about transcending gender. Gender is a construct that was placed on Indigenous people to operate in. And so this gives some flexibility, some nimbleness, of not having to identify by a type of expression that's placed on someone. What's different from the LGBTQ+ is that these are awesome acronyms that sort of kaleidoscope together to create an individual and their identity based on folks that have fought for various rights in the United States. But Two-Spirit or indigiqueerness is something that has always just been a part of our language, always been a part of our culture, and has always been a part of that great hoop, or that great circle of life. I talk often about this great circle of life, or this great hoop. When I was a quite young person, I was given a red willow hoop that was very light, and then I was also given a iron hoop at the same time, and was told to learn to dance with both of these hoops. And in that way, I was learning the idea about what balance is. That hoop, or that circle of life, we refer to it as being the most inclusive design or shape that we can learn from.
Okay. So yeah, Two-Spirit is an indigenous kind of third gender identity. It's become, so I think this person referenced kind of how their culture has a specific term, and different indigenous cultures have their own terms, and Two-Spirit is sort of an overarching term, at least in North America. Something that kind of brings the whole Two-Spirit community together. And so kind of going back to, so some Two-Spirit folks might identify as non-binary, some might identify as trans, or even just queer. Like sometimes I've heard it described as a sexuality. I think it doesn't necessarily fit, go back to the slide. It doesn't necessarily fit kind of, like Western or white kind of conceptions of gender. But going to non-binary, non-binary is a realm in which countless gender alternatives transcending the gender binary live. It's about exploring how the genders man and women can coexist on one. It is also about exploring your genders or non-genders beyond those two options. Overall, it is a journey of feeling yourself out and self-determination. So this is from an article about what non-binary means to people. I think it is, I like to include these quotes because I think it is like a somewhat poorly understood gender identity. And this is from this person, Abdul Corlett. And would anyone else like to read this quote? Feel free to just unmute yourself and jump in. Also no pressure if you don't want to. Okay, I'm gonna read it. Many people might say that non-binary is like the gray area of gender, the undefined space between more defined areas. However, because gray is a mixture of black and white, it is inherently defined by the constructs of the colors it is comprised of. I think of non-binary as the whole crayon box. Non-binary is the liberation from the need to make myself smaller, to fit into preconceived ideas of who and what I am. Non-binary is the experience of myself without definition. This person said that. This person is Rowan Hepps Keeney. And I've had trouble finding this quote, but I a long time ago did a presentation where I found a quote from someone who said, "My soul is non-binary." And so I think that's an idea maybe some folks can relate to. Like, what is your gender at your deepest level? Like, does anyone's soul have a gender? You know, it's kind of a complex thing. Non-binary people challenge us to think about things like that, to really think about our own experiences of gender. Okay, so some takeaways from gender identity. Gender identity is an internal sense of self. It's a vast universe of possibilities, not a binary. And colonization imposed the gender binary. Any other questions about gender identity? And did I answer that last person's question about how women can be non-binary? I'm trying to see who that was in the chat, but I can't get the chat to open again. Yeah, any questions about gender identity before I move on to expression?
I can uplift a question that was put in the chat a little bit earlier.
That sounds great.
So Katrina asked, is it still falling under the trans category if a person is assigned female at birth, but identifies between female and non-binary?
Yeah, so that person might choose to use the term non-binary woman, like, I don't know. But yeah, absolutely. I think it's kind of up to, like, it's up to that person, right? How they would choose to identify. And you would want to kind of course, like, affirm that language and reflect that back to them. Someone might say, yeah, someone who feels that way might say that they're a non-binary woman. They might say they're a woman. They might say they're non-binary. They might say they're questioning. It just kind of depends. But, you know, in terms of, do they have sort of, are they like entitled to say that they're part of the trans community? I would say yes. Like, that does kind of fit under the umbrella.
Thanks. And we did have another question from Sarah. So what are the differences between women with an E, with a Y, and with an X? And which term is the most trans inclusive?
Yeah, I think some of these things, I like a lot of these questions, I'm kind of like, I'm just one non-binary person. I can't tell you, you know, like, so there aren't like a right, like the community is not monolithic, you know, in the same way that no community is monolithic, there isn't like a right answer. I think a lot of this goes back to second wave feminism, the spelling thing, like just not wanting to put the word men and the word women, so then people have these different spellings. It isn't really a trans inclusivity thing. It's like a feminist thing. I don't know that. I don't have strong feelings about that. Some people probably do. Y'all can fight it out in the chat. Okay, so moving on. So as a reminder, transgender identity is when gender identity is not in alignment with sex assigned at birth. For some trans people, this misalignment between identity and sex assigned at birth and or gender presentation, so the way someone looks, can cause distress, right? So this person identifies as male, their gender expression, or this person was assigned male at birth, their gender identity is female, but their gender expression is pretty masculine, right? And so that's causing them some distress. This distress is called gender dysphoria. Gender dysphoria can be rooted in the body itself and or how it's perceived by society, right? So some trans people, if they were on a desert island, they would feel okay about their bodies, and other trans people would still experience some like emotional pain because of how their bodies don't align with, or their presentation doesn't align with their gender identity. Gender dysphoria does not define transness, right? So going back, transness is this misalignment. It doesn't have anything to do with dysphoria, right? And not everyone who has the misalignment feels pain because of it. Psychic pain is not the price of admission for trans identity, but it does help some trans people recognize that they are trans. Dysphoria sometimes also motivates transition, but it is not the only factor motivating transition. What are others? Any thoughts about this? What are some reasons that folks might transition? And we'll kind of talk about what transition is in a minute if you don't know. Any thoughts? I cannot see the chat, so I would need someone to read me the thoughts. Alexander. Oh, I see there is something in the chat. I can't see what it is. Can someone read what's in the chat? Sorry, it's my computer's kind of glitching. Okay, I'm gonna have to move on, but feel free, whoever said that in the chat, feel free to unmute yourself. It seems like maybe Alexander stepped away. So if you want to just unmute yourself and say what you were asking, you can, or positing, you can do that.
Yeah, sorry, I know I was just drinking some water.
Oh, no worries.
Said social acknowledgement.
What?
Chris said social acknowledgement.
Exactly, right? So sometimes folks are, yeah, they're motivated, not by kind of, yeah, like their desert island feelings about their gender, but they're not living on a desert island. We're living in society, right? So that's definitely one reason. So trans folks also recognize that they are trans and or pursue transition because of gender euphoria. And so this was a study on gender euphoria, a qualitative study that I liked. So someone defined it in that study as the electric feeling of happiness and excitement in expressing one's gender, especially when that gender identity and expression are marginalized or ostracized. A little shiny gender breakthrough. So I think not all cis people can identify with the experience of gender dysphoria, but I bet a lot of cis people can identify with the experience of gender euphoria. So like maybe there's like a time you went to a wedding and you looked like real snazzy and you were like, ah, I look so feminine or I look so masculine and I just look really, really good right now and I feel really good about it. So that's gender euphoria. So even though not all trans people experience gender dysphoria, the medical system requires trans people to describe gender dysphoria in order to access medical transition. And so this is something that's wrong with the way that at least insurance is billed right now. Okay, so what is gender transition? So one piece of it is medical transition, which I just mentioned. And so that would look like HRT is hormone replacement therapy. So that's taking hormones. Electrolysis, surgery. We also have changing one's name as part of transition, socially and or legally. Changing pronouns, changing gender markers on identification, like your ID or your passport or your birth certificate, your social security card. Binding and tucking, which are things folks do. So tucking is like making the penis less visible, and binding is like binding the breast or the chest. And yeah, and then we just have gender expression, maybe, and we're going to talk in a second about what gender expression looks like. So transition is a menu, so not everyone does everything. And it's a menu that not everyone can access, like not everyone can afford everything on the menu, right? So changing your name socially is like, might be maybe like a cheaper item on the menu, like the dollar special, but then surgery is like thousands and thousands of dollars. So I mean, like, so there's, when we're talking about affording, we mean financially, but then we also mean kind of what is the cost of these things. So like, you know, for a teenager living at home, even kind of changing their name within their household is kind of out of reach. So it's kind of complex what's possible for people. It also is not an overnight process. So these things can take many, many years for people to kind of access everything that they even want to access. Not everyone wants to access everything, but if they do, what they do want to access, it takes time to get to. And I am so frustrated by celebrities changing everything overnight, because it's not how things happen in real life. So for example, when folks are on HRT, there's like a long period where their gender presentation is kind of ambiguous, even if they're trying to access a like a gender presentation that is binary. So like they're trying to appear like appear like a cisgender woman. It takes, there's a period of time where they, you know, might feel some anxiety in public because people are not sure how to read them. There's a process. Okay, what is gender expression? So we're going to talk a little bit more about this, but first they use these terms, masculine, feminine, and other. What do we mean by the terms masculine and feminine? Any thoughts? Let's see if anyone is dropping. So yeah, feel free to unmute or just drop it in the chat.
So Maria just shared, Hollywood does not always do justice to those who can't afford the menu. I think that was a thought for the previous slide.
Yes, absolutely. Exactly. I really like Elliot Page, and I got really mad when he like posted this Instagram photo with like this 6-pack, like over, I was like, where did that 6-pack come from, Elliot? Like, yeah, just kind of was able to do like, I'm going to step out of the limelight for 6 months. I'm going to do a big reveal. That's not what real life is like for everybody, you know? Okay, I think my point in asking this question is that each of these individually is a very complex construct, and it's kind of problematic, right? Like, what is femininity? What is masculinity? Like, these are socially constructed ideas. They mean different things in different cultural contexts, like outside the United States, inside the United States. Like, your mom's idea of femininity is different from my idea, your idea. Like, we all have, yeah. What do we mean? We don't really know what we mean, you know? Again, kind of zooming in on the head of the pin, it's not pointy, we're like, I don't know. So here are some examples of gender expression or presentation. Face shape, body shape, hair length, hairstyle, clothes, mannerisms, hand size, foot size, height, Adam's apple, lack thereof, facial hair, lack thereof, eyebrows, voice. Those are just some examples. I'm sure there are others. So, you know, a really important point I wanted to make is that gender expression is on the spectrum of things we can control to things we can't control. So height, you really don't have a lot of control over your height. You know, people often have control over what they wear. And then something in the middle might be something like your voice, where, yeah, you maybe can control it, but it would require a lot of like training, maybe some lessons, like a lot of time on YouTube, like it's hard, you know, it requires a lot of kind of intention and practice. That would be true also of something like mannerisms, right? Not everyone has access to that. And this idea of access is again kind of relative, right? So like a homeless trans youth might not even have control over what they wear, you know? Something that for a lot of people would be more in the realm of what they can control, or someone who is like living in a very restrictive environment, or say in an abusive relationship, might not have control over that. So it is important to remember that no surgeries or drugs turn someone into a man or a woman, and transgender people's genders are no less real or worthy of respect if they haven't had particular surgeries or other medical treatments, right? So like, we don't know why someone's gender expression is what it is. We don't actually know anything about that. And that's a quote from the National Center for Trans Equality. So some takeaways from gender expression is that it does not necessarily indicate gender identity. Gender expression or presentation includes stuff within and outside of people's control, and changing gender expression can be a part of transition, but it isn't always. Any questions about gender expression before I move on? Okay. So I kind of want to like zoom in a little bit more on like what's happening in our brains. So like computers, our brains tend to unconsciously calculate people's genders based on all these little pieces of their gender expression. And it may even vary from person to person or like moment to moment. And so it's like, this is my little flow chart of what I imagine happens in our brain. Okay? I am not a neuroscientist, this is very unscientific. So we see someone's kind of gender presentation or expression, and I almost imagine there's like these little point values. We're like, okay, there's an Adam's apple, but there's a dress, and also there's long hair, and also there's jewelry, but also this person is really tall, whatever, you know, we're like trying to kind of piece it all together in some way. There's some point values, there's like some calculating that happens, and like, but all this happens in this moment before we're not consciously thinking about it, and our mouths just spit out, hello ma'am, or she, or whatever, he, like we just come up with something. And so what is challenging about matching our intention and our behavior is that we are trying to interrupt a very fast and unconscious process, right? And so kind of what we're trying to work on is like, how do we do that? Any thoughts on how we do that? And we're going to talk more about it in the last section, but I just wanted to give you all a chance to like weigh in on that if that's helpful, to hear from each other about it. Okay. So we don't have X-ray vision, and we can't tell someone's gender identity by looking at them, right? But accurately acknowledging it is so extremely impactful. So for example, using a trans youth's chosen name reduces their risk of suicidal behavior by 56%. And, you know, we don't have that kind of data on adults, but I would imagine it's very similar. And this was a really robust study that was done, I think, I'm trying to remember who did it. I think it was either the American Psychological Association or the American Medical Association. And it was like a giant, it was like thousands and thousands and thousands of people. So our mission is to acknowledge people as who they are, as the way they see themselves, right? So another kind of piece of that that's complicated is that when people do feel comfortable disclosing to us, when we give people a chance to do that, what they might mean by trans or by woman even, like what might be different than what that word means to you. And so this is called the language paradox. And what it means is the words that people use for their gender identities are important and worth being familiar with. And at the same time, people's gender identities, including yours, if you really think about it, cannot be fully captured in language. And the words they use are highly idiosyncratic, right? They're individualized. And so how do we resolve, what do we do about that? How do we resolve the language paradox? Any thoughts?
So here's some things that have been coming up in the chat. So building gender neutral language into your vocabulary. I think for pronouns is helpful. Learning at an early age and practice gender neutral language.
Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. I love that a bunch of, so I think y'all were answering this earlier question of like, well, I won't go back, but yeah, like how do we interrupt this unconscious process? Yes, gender neutral language and building that in is so helpful. And I love that a few folks said practice, right? Which we'll talk about in a minute, but it's really like, I have had to be very intentional, like almost like I'm learning another language, you know, like I learned Spanish and in my head, when I'm making my bed, which I'll be honest, I don't do that often. I don't say, so maybe that's not the best example, but I'll say when taking a shower, I'll say in Spanish, I'm taking a shower, you know, like you have to really kind of practice using this language every day. And so like when a friend of mine changes their pronouns, I'll save them in my phone as like their name with their new pronouns next to it, for example. Like, and then every time I talk about them, I'll try to use their pronouns, and I'll be like cooking eggs and I'll be like, Sam is going to visit me. He is really nice. I'm looking forward to seeing him over the weekend. Like I'm like making an effort. These things don't happen by themselves, right? And so, yeah, it's kind of, you can make it a little bit mindless, a little bit fun, but putting in that time is how we interrupt this process and affirm people. Okay, moving back to the language paradox. So we can't fully, yeah, it's very difficult to like fully understand what people mean, but luckily, the way that we resolve the paradox is kind of falling back on our client-centered skills. So in the same way that someone says to us, like, I'm a survivor, I've experienced trauma, you might say to that, like, tell me share about that, what you feel comfortable sharing. What does that mean to you when you say that? What does that mean to you? You know? So if someone says they're trans, you can be like, tell me more about that. What does that mean to you? If that feels appropriate to do in that moment, it might not. And so that's kind of a way to, to learn about what folks are doing. And also kind of similar to how, you know, when your client uses a term for, say, the trauma they experienced, you don't want to, if they don't use the term rape, you don't want to use the term rape. Like you similarly, you want to reflect back the language that someone is using. And you can also kind of build the relationship that you'll kind of figure it out over time, what they mean. Okay, so because of the language paradox, and because folks kind of can have like a false sense of expertise when we spend a lot of time on definitions, I have not included a lot of terms. And I think that I know folks really want to know all the words. So I do have a vocab sheet that I can send out to everybody. And I'm happy to share that. But I thought for now, if you want to type the terms that you feel confused about in the chat, and then other folks, if you see a term that you know the definition of, you can add it. Yeah, is there anything that you were like, I really want to leave this workshop knowing what this word means? I've heard this word and I don't get it. And yeah, Alexander, feel free to share them out if folks are saying stuff. Really? No word anxiety? That's very exciting. But I also don't totally believe it. Yes.
We just got one. Pangendered.
Yeah, so with this one, I think we can just figure out from the Latin. So like pan would be like multi. So pansexual also means like attracted to, well, it's a little bit more complex, but yeah, so pangender would just be like multiple genders, I think. It isn't, I haven't heard it a ton. I think like, yeah, so some people are like bigender would be like probably male and female, and then some people might want to use a word that implies that it's more than that there's maybe other genders involved too. Okay.
We also have asexual.
Yeah, so that would fit in with sexual orientation and not with gender, right? So if we go back to that gender unicorn, sexual orientation is separate from gender identity. So that means that trans people, like cis people, can be heterosexual, can be bisexual, can be pansexual, can have kind of any sexual orientation. And one sexual orientation is asexual, which typically means that folks don't feel sexual attraction. And asexuality is also a spectrum. I'm trying to remember the name. There's a really great asexual organization. Is Chris still here? If so, do you remember the name of the really good asexual org that I definitely think that's one to kind of research a little bit further, because it's outside the scope of this particular workshop, because it is a sexual orientation and not a gender identity. But if anyone, I can also see if I can find. Yeah, so there's like some orgs and some folks doing great work kind of explaining what asexual identity is about and the asexual spectrum and the aromantic spectrum out there on the internet. So I definitely endorse doing your own research. Okay, any last questions? All right. So this concludes the Gender 101 section of the training. And so now we're just going to quickly move through some of the issues that we have to overcome specifically in working in kind of the sexual assault response prevention field. So rape crisis centers are at the intersection of spheres that have historically marginalized trans people. So I just kind of want to situate this here. Okay, so when we're talking about kind of the criminal justice, legal policing system, 1 in 5 trans women have spent time in jail or prison. And I think it's important to kind of break things down by race, because of course, when we're talking about criminalization and policing, the impacts are not equitable across races, right? We see a lot of disparities, and that includes in the trans population. So 12% of trans people, 5% of Hispanic trans people, 9% of Indigenous and Alaskan Native people, and 2% of white trans people have been physically assaulted by a police officer. So we have this historical criminalization of cross-dressing, this historical criminalization of even queerness, which all led to Stonewall, which launched the LGBT rights movement, right, back in 1969. Okay, and we're talking about healthcare, which is also kind of part of our work. 1/3 of trans people who saw a healthcare provider in the past year reported a negative experience. 50% of American Indian and Alaskan Natives did. 1/3 of trans people lack access to regular health care. We have this historical and current pathologization of LGBTQ identity. We talked about how you need to be kind of experiencing dysphoria or like kind of psychic pain, right, to have access to medical transition. That's like a source of a lot of frustration in the trans community. And then we have feminism over here, right? And so we think of feminism as this really positive force historically. And then we also have some critiques of it, particularly of kind of mainstream second wave feminism as being white, as being transphobic. So this is Susan Stryker, who's a white trans woman and a historian, a trans historian. As a historian, I remember the explicit, really unchecked feminist transphobia that gained a lot of traction in the 1980s, and I had just assumed that it would fade away over time. So this is kind of, I guess I wanted to kind of highlight this quote because the 80s is around the time that a lot of rape crisis centers are getting started. And also, it does not fade away over time, right? That's kind of the implication of the quote. And so, yeah, there's still a lot, you know, we have trans exclusive radical feminists. We have a lot of transphobia in feminism even today. And so, you know, we have rape crisis centers situated right at the middle of these different systems. And these cis-sexist, so that's kind of a word to refer to kind of oppression. These legacies don't just affect trans people's perceptions of sexual assault agencies, they also affect how sexual assault agencies treat trans people. So for example, 22% of trans people who said staff thought they were trans were refused service, verbally harassed, or physically assaulted at a sexual assault or DV agency, domestic violence agency, compared to 2 in 4 homeless trans people and 3 in 4 undocumented trans people. So we can kind of see intersectionality, like how these oppressions are layered. Yeah, so folks are not always having a positive experience with us, you know, and so I know that we're here because we want to change that. And so now we're going to talk about how to change that. So let me switch to the other presentation. Okay. And let me just check where I'm at with time. Any questions? Yeah, any questions before I jump into this? Have I missed anything in the chat?
We are all caught up in the chat.
Awesome, thank you. Okay. So these are just a few, here, so I'll give you the overview. So what are some trans welcoming practices that we can implement that are kind of simple? Yeah, so there's kind of just a few. I wanted to keep it really tight. I also want to recommend one of my employers is this wonderful agency called Forge. They do a ton of trainings and get like a lot more in depth about specific settings and specific contexts. So for example, do you want to do support groups that include trans people? They have like a whole series of trainings on that. So that website for that org is forge-forward.org. I still can't get the chat to load. I'm so sorry. If someone wants to drop that in the chat, I would be so grateful. forge-forward.org. Thank you so much, Alexandra. So yeah, they have a lot more detailed information on their website, in their YouTube channel. But I kind of wanted to just keep it like some really basic principles. All right. So one is only ask what you need to, right? And so I think it's natural to have curiosity about people's experiences of gender, specifically trans people's. We don't understand it a lot. We may, when we do encounter a trans client, we may feel some curiosity about their journey, about their bodies, and that's normal. And it's also really, really important not to verbalize that because a lot of trans people's experiences of marginalization are kind of around this somewhat like objectifying focus on those things, right? This focus on transition, this focus on their bodies. You know, trans people's experiences shouldn't be about their bodies more than anyone else's experience of the world or of their sexuality or whatever. And particularly survivors, right, have been really objectified in this way. And so it can be really harmful to then kind of encounter a provider who's asking invasive questions. So let's talk a little bit about intake forms specifically. Yeah, so I see in the chat, I can finally pull up the chat, it's very exciting. Maria said more agencies need to hire personnel who have those experiences. Absolutely, like, yeah, having LGBTQ folks on staff can be really helpful. Yeah, and you know, and everyone still needs to be trained, right? Okay, so we don't want to ask just sex and just male or female, because how does a trans person complete this? We talked about how biological sex is a really murky concept. What do they mean when they ask this question? What if someone is non-binary? What if someone is intersex? Like, there's so many people who are not fitting in here, and we don't even know what's actually being asked, right? And this is kind of a typical way that sex or gender is asked on intake forms. Okay, so if it's really important to capture every trans person you serve, so say that you work maybe in a hospital, or say that you want to capture that information for grants because you are trying to serve a certain number of trans people, you really need to know the gender identities of the people you serve. Maybe you have like an LGBT specific grant. The most evidence-based way to ask is to ask, what is your current gender identity? And see how there's a bunch of options here. And something else, and you can check all that apply, and what sex were you assigned at birth? And so then what you're looking for as you're analyzing these answers is the mismatch, right? So if someone says that they were assigned female at birth and now they identify as anything other than just this box exclusively, the female box exclusively, then they would be counted in the trans category for the sake of like data collection. And if you don't need that level of detail, then don't ask, right? Because right now we're under the rule that we're talking about is only ask what you need to know. So if you don't need to know that, you don't have to ask that way. Just ask what people's gender is. You can leave it blank. Cis people tend to know what that question means. It's a way to just be inclusive, not intrusive. People can put down however they identify. Okay, so when do you actually need to know people's medical information? Is there ever a time that you need to know that? What are y'all's thoughts? The chat left me again also. So if there's anything in the chat, I can't see it.
There isn't anything in the chat directly about this, but we did have a comment from Maria saying that those data sheets are outdated and used for survey of those served in the community.
Mhm.
And we did just get someone, so Tara said only if we're gauging if they need medical attention before seeking services with us. But I guess that's not really their history.
Yes. Yeah. So I think there are some, you know, maybe if you're talking about forensic exams, and you want to be able to advocate for them, some questions about kind of medical stuff might be like anatomy might be helpful. So if, you know, I think that is particularly if you're trying to kind of buffer folks around the nurses, like potential like awkward interactions with same nurses or whatever. But that's kind of, I personally think that's the only context. And I guess I put this up here because when I worked at a rape crisis center, I got into a disagreement with the therapist about whether they felt, they would say like, you know, it's really helpful to know this stuff as part of someone's history when I'm first kind of engaging in therapy with them. You know, I want to know their trauma history and I want to know if they've experienced medical transition. Because it might be helpful. And I was kind of like, a lot of things might be helpful, you know, like, but is the potential negative impact of that, is it helpful enough that it offsets like the fact that you could be harming your rapport with them by asking that question? And that has to do with like how charged these questions feel for trans people. And also like, I don't know, is it normal for you to ask if people have had like other forms of surgery, like a kidney transplant? Are you asking that as part of your first session? You know, you want to make sure that it's consistent. Like a surgery is a surgery. If you are asking medical history, like, okay, that's valid. But just make sure that it's consistent. And that might be like, you know, on your intake form saying like, have you had any kind of traumatic medical experiences or surgeries that you'd like to share? So yeah, just only asking the information that is relevant, kind of making it consistent across trans people and cis people. And so when you do truly need to know information, explaining why. And so, you know, in the context of maybe a forensic exam, you know, maybe you do need to ask about anatomy and explaining like, you know, I'm asking these questions about anatomy. I really hope I'm not making you uncomfortable. You know, I'm asking because I want to be able to like support you and advocate for you with the nurse and kind of make sure that you're not in an awkward situation. But also you can navigate that yourself if you prefer to, you know, always kind of being trauma informed, letting the client kind of decide how the interaction goes as much as possible and being transparent, because that's one of the principles of trauma informed care, right? Oops. Okay, so reduce gatekeeping. So trans folks face a lot of gatekeeping. They face, like we kind of looking at the statistics, they're often denied access to services, right? They might have been turned away from your agency, from another agency in the area already. They might have been turned away from their healthcare provider. And so part of like a way that you can work on being an agency that's really serving trans folks well is helping them access services that they need, including medical transition. And so that might involve like building relationships with other agencies, doing like really warm handoffs, you know, making sure that as folks are handed off to another agency that they're either like you're able to pass them off to someone who is trans informed and trans competent, or you're kind of having a conversation with them about some of the challenges that they might experience. Like, you know, there's one person who works in this agency. I've heard them be pretty good about pronouns. I'm not sure about other folks, so I'm going to refer you to that person, even though they aren't typically the person I would refer to for this service. How does this sound? Would you rather I refer you to like the person for the service who might not be great about pronouns, right? Like you want to kind of just consider folks' experiences around gender in the referral process, if that makes sense. And we're going to talk more about that in a minute. Okay, and then, yeah, creating gender neutral and gender integrated spaces. So what are some spaces that could potentially be gender neutral or gender integrated? Well, so first, why is creating these spaces important? Any thoughts about that? Any thoughts in the chat? Okay. So so creating these spaces is important for multiple reasons. So kind of going back to this idea that creating spaces that are inclusive for trans folks, that are kind of transcending binaries, can be actually good for everyone, is like that, you know, when we're really focused on creating kind of female only spaces as a proxy for safe spaces, we're not being totally honest with ourselves or our clients, right? Because we know that women perpetrate violence at about the same rates as men, which was another workshop I did in this series. We know that men can often be survivors, that men are survivors at about the same rate as women. So even kind of when we're not thinking about trans people, we are not addressing the realities of violence or safety when we're kind of focused on creating this bubble of female only spaces. And so, you know, by opening up our spaces, we're also, you know, maybe challenging some of our clients' triggers in a helpful way. And so, I think there's one way to work with triggers that's like, we should make sure clients never get triggered. And then there's another way to work with triggers that's like, people are going to get triggered. We don't know what our clients' triggers are. They might be the color of the walls in the room. They might be like the smell of a casserole. Like, we don't know, you know, like people have very idiosyncratic and unique triggers where it's not possible to create this kind of, you know, hermetically sealed, perfect trigger-free space. And so our role isn't to kind of make things perfectly emotionally safe. Our role is to kind of allow things to be addressed as they come up, and kind of to have the facilitation skills and the clinical skills to kind of process things through and make them safer, make them as safe as they need to be. I don't know if that makes any sense. And that's kind of just my personal, like, you know, disclaimer, like that's kind of how I approach the work. And I understand that other folks might have different views. But I think it's worth kind of thinking about these questions and having a conversation about them. And so what spaces could be gender integrated? So messaging and curricula about the root causes of violence. So we kind of, again, in this other workshop talked about like, power and control does not equal masculinity. It does equal toxic masculinity, right? But like making that distinction really clear. Kind of decoupling maleness or masculinity from the root causes of sexual violence. Bathrooms can be gender neutral, support groups can be gender neutral or inclusive, a shelter can be neutral or inclusive, the staff, the board, the volunteers, the organization name, if it's like a women's center, like what message is that sending, right? And so these things are like not going to happen overnight. They're like going to involve a lot of conversations. You might have to send people this webinar. You might have to access a lot of other resources. But when we're talking about being truly trans inclusive spaces, this is what it looks like, right? And then of course, there's also like literature and materials. And I think that folks often focus disproportionately on that. So like it'll be a women's center, but there'll be like a man on the pamphlet, a man on the cover of the pamphlet or whatever. Okay, but like, I think it's really important that the kind of messaging and literature and PR around a space matches the reality of it. So if you're saying that you're trans inclusive, if y'all are making like a pride post on your social media, is it actually a safe space for LGBTQ folks, or are they going to show up and have a really bad experience? You know, it's a lot easier to make the post than it is to do this work. And so how can you do both at the same time? Or even prioritize the deeper work. Okay, so often misgivings come up for folks around this idea of creating gender neutral or gender integrated spaces. Do y'all have any concerns that you would like to process with each other in the chat? Or out loud? Okay. Am I missing anything in the chat?
So far, we are up to date.
Cool. Okay. lastly, we have incorporating pronouns. So it looks like we're actually going to finish early and we'll be able to do some Q&A. Okay. So using someone's pronouns communicates that you see them the way that they see themselves. And so here are some places that you can integrate pronouns into the work. So one is labels for support groups and events, like that one. So you can buy name tags that have like name and pronouns built in, like just those stickers. Question, you can make pronouns a question on an intake form. And so when you have that, include at least he, she, they, and other with a blank, because some folks have neopronouns, which are like Z and Zer, so pronouns that aren't he or she or they. You can put pronouns in your email signatures, you can put them on your business cards, and you can introduce yourself when you first meet a client with your name and pronoun. So I had they highlighted because I wanted to just take a minute and talk about the they, them controversy. So a pushback that I have heard about singular they, them pronouns is that they are not grammatically correct. Your English teacher used to correct you on them. Therefore, they're not grammatically correct. So I wanted to kind of do some debunking around that just for a minute. So they, them, singular they, them pronouns were used by Shakespeare. They are in every dictionary. They are officially grammatically correct according to like every newspaper, the copy editing societies, like everybody. And they're also not just for non-binary people, right? So, and I mean that in a few different ways. So kind of how we talked about how someone can be non-binary and they can be a woman, like someone can use they, them pronouns and be a woman or be a man. We shouldn't kind of necessarily make assumptions about the pronouns, about people's genders based on the pronouns that they use. The other way I kind of meant that is that, yeah, we use they, them pronouns every day in daily life. When we talk about someone whose gender we don't know. And so sometimes people feel thrown off conjugating singular they, but they actually do it all the time. And so, yeah, I just kind of want to empower you that you do already probably have these skills. I've been using singular they for most of this presentation. It might not have struck you as super weird. So just like, yeah, we got this. It's already a part of the English language. So if you are going to do an introduction, when you first meet someone, you could say, hi, my name is whatever, and I'm, say, the intake coordinator. My pronoun is blank, or my pronouns are she, her, he, him, they, them, ze, zir. What about you? Okay, so sometimes when folks think about this idea, they feel some anxiety around it. Often that anxiety boils down to what if people react with confusion or hostility, right? What if people are like, what the heck is a pronoun? What if people are like, you can't tell that I'm a man? Like they're mad at you about it. So what, like that really stresses people out. That's a concern that folks have about kind of changing the routine. So this is what I would suggest. Preparing a script that explains why you ask. Pronouns and defining pronouns in that script as well. So pronouns are words used to describe people like he, she, and they. I ask people their pronouns because some people, particularly trans people, don't always have the pronouns we assume. And it's important to me to be respectful of the pronouns everyone uses. It's important to me to be inclusive of trans people. Write it in words that feel comfortable to you. Practice it, make it a part of your routine in the same way that other things are like a part of your intake and a part of your routine, right? Like as healthcare providers, as mental health care providers, we script things, you know, and that's normal, that's okay. And so this can become part of that. And what if people, yeah, so kind of the other kind of way that I answer that question, what if people react with confusion or hostility, is that part of showing up for trans folks and being an ally to trans folks or an accomplice or whatever language you want to use is navigating some awkwardness so the trans folks don't have to face danger. So it's like better that you have the conversation than that they have the conversation, right? It's an opportunity for you to show up and practice your values. Okay, so another big question around kind of pronouns or like knowing someone's gender, is it that like there is the potential to end up outing people, and that isn't okay, right? We don't want to out people without their consent. And so what do you do about that? How do we prevent that? And so it actually involves more scripting or more kind of intake forms, having a conversation with clients about, so you're making referrals. Okay, I'm going to refer you to this agency. What pronouns would you like me to use with them? And you can provide information like, yeah, I'm referring you to a shelter. They don't have, this is a binary shelter. We don't have to refer you there, but it is the only shelter in the area. They only have space for men and women. How do you want to handle this? Like, let's strategize together. What do you think would be safest? For example, the world isn't perfect, right? And so we're kind of supporting our clients and navigating these situations that are sometimes the best that we can do. Or like say that someone is at the hospital with a family member. They have told you that they use they, them pronouns, and you're like, okay, when I go out and talk to your mom, what pronouns do you want me to use for you? And so this is an example of an intake of a form used by a teacher in classes. And so I kind of just liked the way that they broke down these different settings. And I feel like it would be really cool to make one for rape crisis center settings. So yeah, pronouns you use, may I use them in front of the class? May I use them when I contact home? May I use them in front of other teachers? So may I use them with like the family that you've come here with? May I use them with referrals to other agencies? May I use them with the staff, etc. Would you like me to follow up about your pronouns in a private conversation? So that's kind of one way to handle consent. Again, so I understand that these things may feel kind of a little bit overwhelming now because we're talking about kind of new protocols, it's unfamiliar, but it is possible to build these into forms, to script them, to kind of, run them by like an LGBT agency in your area. Take some time and think. Okay, so what about what you do if you mess up someone's pronouns, or maybe mess up, the way that you refer to them. So we have this little handy dandy grid. So this is over here, we have the quickest, most comfortable, and least emotionally intense option of catching it in the moment. So I also just want to say, like, you will mess up, and that is normal, and I want you to like accept that now. You will mess up, and also it is really important to work hard not to, right? We are not perfect, but it also doesn't have to be. We are not perfect. We are committed to growing. We're holding these things in balance, right? There's this binary that we're moving through, a dialectic according to DBT. So the quick catch looks like this. The other day I was hanging out with Jennifer, and when I was talking to him, I mean her. Anyway, she said blah, 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 blah. That's it. That's all it is. You just really quickly, I was talking to him, I mean her, and she said, like, you just very quickly catch it. That's the ideal, right? Maybe this has happened a few times and you're feeling kind of awkward about it. So then you can move to apologize quickly in the moment. So that is like a little bit more awkward, a little bit not quite as fast. And also it's a little bit more emotionally intense, both for you and for the person receiving it. And so that might look like, the other day, I was talking to Jennifer, and she said blah, blah, blah. So it's still kind of quick, so it isn't that intense, right? And then the most intense option is to like do this full-on apology. And I would say, like, handle this with caution. I think that it's something that well-intentioned cis people go to as their first option, but I think it can be really awkward to receive as a trans person. I'm just catching some things in the chat here. Okay, I'm gonna read the chat when I'm done with my little explanation. So this question of apologizing later is really, when is that appropriate? I would say that that's most appropriate if it's like, maybe like you're struggling a lot, and when you do apologize later, you really don't want to center your experience, and you really want to make sure that you're not looking for reassurance that you're doing okay, because I think that's the piece that can feel really uncomfortable and awkward for trans folks, as it can for like any marginalized community, right? When someone's apology, or anyone, when the apology isn't really about the person you're apologizing to, it's about the person giving the apology. So like the kind of stereotypical like apology that I would not recommend is sort of like, oh my God, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I don't know why I keep doing this. I really want to get it right. It's really important to me. I promise. I really support trans people. Like my grandson is trans. I just really, I don't know what's wrong with me. Right. It puts the person that you're apologizing to in this very awkward position of like needing to take on doing a lot of emotional work, which is why it's all the way over here with the emotional intensity, right? So what would a better apology sound like? Any thoughts on what a better apology might sound like? Feel free to unmute or just drop it in the chat. Something clear and brief where you genuinely own the mistake. Beautiful, Tara. I love it. Yeah. So, hey, I just wanted to apologize that I've been messing up your pronoun. I want you to know that I'm working on it and it's not okay. I'll get there. So making the attempt to correct it and continue using the correct pronoun. Yeah. So I think if you need to kind of let the person know, like out loud, do an out loud apology, or maybe like it happened in an awkward setting or something, and that's why you feel like you need to do the apology. Yes, like saying, you're saying, hey, this isn't okay. I'm really sorry. I'm working on it. Those are kind of the three components, like the commitment to continue working on it is important as well. Because also I think sometimes the apology is like an excuse, like I'm not working on it. Like, look, it's really, I'm just, I'm old school. I've been doing it this way a long time. I'm doing the best I can, but I may never get there, is like something you hear a lot as a trans person. And I'm like, I don't want to hear that you're just never going to get there. I want you to get there. Like, I want to support you in getting there. I want that for everybody, Okay. Oh yeah, I wanted to check. So I saw, the cat disappeared again, but I noticed that someone talked about ma'am and sir being really ingrained. I agree, those are hard, especially in the South. And I want to acknowledge that we don't have I don't know of a great like honorific that's neutral. You have mix as an alternative to Ms. or Mr., but there isn't really like a ma'am and sir equivalent. And then relearning they, them. Yeah, it is something to relearn. And so it's something to practice, right? Okay. And then how to mess up less over time is practice. Like I said, yeah. So yeah, practice in your car, practice. There's even websites where you can practice conjugating. Just kind of reciting things in your head can be really useful. Okay. And then what to do when someone else messes up. So this is another thing that kind of comes up pretty frequently in the workplace. So maybe like you're really on top of it, your coworker isn't, and you're just like not really sure how to handle it. Maybe they're your boss, so it's like extra awkward, It all kind of depends, like, I understand that it can be hard to kind of navigate those situations with like workplace power dynamics or questions about whether the client is there. So here's a few different options. So for this one, we have on this axis, we have politeness, and on this axis, we have emotional intensity. Again, for you, for other people there, for the person you're talking to, for everybody. So the most polite and kind of the quickest and easiest is the repeat back. And so that is when you're practicing active listening, and you're just affirming what they said, but you're switching the pronoun. So say that someone says, yeah, I was hanging out with, with Joan the other day, and yeah, and he and I, we went to the movie. You could be like, oh, so you and Joan went to the movie, and what did she think of it? Like, it's very conversational, but in the process of kind of engaging in a normal conversation, you're changing the pronoun. And so I think the person might not even notice that you're correcting them, but because we're social creatures who mimic the people around us, they will typically conform to what you're doing over time, especially if you keep jumping in. So maybe you'll need to find yourself active listening slightly more than you typically would, but it can be a really effective strategy that also is very non-confrontational. So then if that isn't working, or maybe the person is there, maybe it's not your boss, maybe it feels really, maybe it's someone who's who you supervise, so it feels really important to kind of nip this in the bud. You can correct in the moment, and so that's like a quick, you would jump in, so it would be like a little bit of an interruption. So they would say, you know, she and I, and you would say, oh, you mean he, or like, yeah, so he, and or you don't even have to say the you mean part, like, oh, so you and him. Just kind of jump in and correct it right there. And then, you know, the most intense would be a conversation about it, where you, would say like, hey, I've been noticing, you know, and that would happen outside of the moment, right? Because you don't want to embarrass the person if there's other people present. Maybe this would be important again if you're like, maybe you're supervising someone, maybe it's been going on for like weeks. And you're like, oh, I really want to support this trans person. It's important to me to be an ally to them. Like, you know, and I think this talk about it moment, this conversation is an opportunity to share the strategies that have worked for you. It's an opportunity to like be humble. Like, you don't want to be like, hey, you better get it together. You know, it's a chance to say like, yeah, I've been noticing you've been messing up. You know, I know it was hard for me at first too, and here's what worked for me. Like, I went to this workshop with Anoli. They told me to practice in my car. That was really the thing that did it for me. You know, so I know it can be hard, but it is really important to me that you're committed to this, like that we're all committed to this in order to support this person. Yes, I said mixed. Sorry, looking at the chat. Okay. I think, yeah, that's all that I have. Any questions about that last piece or about any of it? Let's see if there's anything in the chat. Yeah, any thoughts, any questions? I'll just give you all another minute. Okay. Is there anything in the chat that I missed?
Well, Sam just said, thanks, Anoli. That was awesome.
Awesome. I'm so glad to hear that. So then, yeah, next we have evaluations. I'm just gonna just exit out of my screen sharing so that I can share and the link to y'all. Thank you, Maria. I'm glad you enjoyed the conversation. I did as well. And let me just, yeah, here, let me pull up this link. So this is, so I think we still have 2 evaluations, Alexandria.
Yeah, I mean, if it's completely fine with you, you can also just use your evaluation.
It is totally fine either way. So yeah, so I have an eval that like I use just to kind of inform my future work, and then NC CASA has one here. Here we go. Thank you, Heather. Yeah, I'm glad it was helpful for folks. You can always here, I'm gonna just drop in the chat my email, my website, as well as my email address. My website is just my name. My email is my name at Gmail. And if you all want to reach out for more information to chat further, I am available. Awesome. Yeah, so yeah, thank you so much, everybody. So the question about the certificate. Okay, Samantha wants me to share the paper about healing. Samantha, if you want to email me, I will get that to you. And Ashley asked about the certificate. If you fill out the NC CASA evaluation, that's how you get the certificate. All right. Yeah, thank you all so much. Yeah, I'm just gonna drop my eval one more time. If you wanna, Alex, if you wanna put, Alexander, if you wanna put the NC CASA one too, just so that y'all, yeah, can go ahead and fill that out. Thank you so much, everybody.